True. Let's go to Comma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chill drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.
Alphonse de Cartefax presents us with a map showing blacks in various places in early America. The Charus of Brazil, the Yamasee of Florida, and the Black Caribs of St. Vincent, pre-Columbian. Alonso Ponce cites them off Campeche in Mexico. River Palacio cites them off Tegucigalpa in the Nicaraguan-Honduran border. Ramon Pane speaks of them as the black gold traders. Fray Gregorio Garcia cites them off Cartagena, Colombia. A dozen Europeans, Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Columbus, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Peter Martyr, Lopez de Gomara, Rodrigo de Colmenares, Alphonse de Cartefax, L'Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg, Alonso Ponce, River Palacio, Ramon Pane, Fray Gregorio Garcia, seeing things that are not there.
When it comes to African-centered history or Afrocentrism, one of the most controversial scholars, especially the Westerners who despise African-centered analysis, is Ivan van Sertima. And Ivan van Sertima is used as a puppet by many of these Western scholars to prove or to try to promote the illegitimacy of African-centered scholarship. The dominant narrative of American history, promoted by Americanists and different Western historical theorists, posit that the New World was discovered by Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus discovered Beringian migratory populations who came south into North America and then South America. This is the mainstream Western model. Now, African-centered scholars like Ivan van Sertima, Cheikh Anta Diop, Martin Bernal, who would be a Westerner, in many ways supported by African-centered scholars, modern scholars like Festus Onuegbu, Curry Malo, etc., have argued for African presence in the Americas long before 1492. And their history, their model, is drawn from archaeology, linguistics, botany, and historical accounts that confront a deeply entrenched academic orthodoxy. And this reveals as much about the politics of knowledge as it does about ancient transoceanic voyages. And those of y'all who are familiar with the legendary John Henry Clark, he said that Europeans didn't only colonize history, they colonized information about history. So it goes a lot deeper than what meets the eye. A lot of this evidentiary information is multifaceted, right? The most iconic artifacts are the colossal stone heads of the Olmec civilization, from the 12th to the 4th century before the Common Era. And you see sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo. According to Kumagisha, early observers like Jose Melgar saw these monuments as possessing prominent African features. And proponents of the model that these were Africans, or at least influenced by Africans, argue that the artists were sculpting what they saw. And these heads represent real African individuals who were present and influential in Olmec society. This archaeological testimony is supplemented by terracotta figures that depict a diversity of African phenotypes, from super-Saharan Africans to infra-Saharan Africans. According to Sertima, Kumagisha, and Wyszynski, Olmec crania exhibited a combination of morphological features, including pronounced alveolar prognathism, a broad nasal aperture with a low root, a shallower canine fossa, and, as corroborated by contemporary sculptures, full everted lips that collectively form a morphological pattern more commonly associated with infra-Saharan African populations. This statistical analysis indicates a measurable biodistance from typical East Asian and Native American morphological patterns, and this reveals a heterogeneous population, which could be interpreted as evidence of African admixture among ancient Paleo-Americans. Other scholars such as Rolando Gonzalez Jose, based on a multivariate analysis of cranial measurements from the HALS database, found that Paleo-Americans clustered more closely with Africans and Melanesian populations than with modern Native Americans or East Asians. The results indicate ancient Californian specimens are defined within the Paleo-American cluster, and this promotes a more complex multi-component model of the initial peopling of the Americas. Ancient DNA from Mexico supplies concrete genetic signals that were consistent with pre-Columbian African gene flow and thus lend genetic plausibility to Ivan van Sertima's proposition of African contact with early Mesoamerican cultures such as the Olmecs. Several ancient individuals from what is now Mexico carry Y chromosome lineages that are not strictly local. YCH025 from Chichen Itza of the 9th century of the Common Era bears the B2M182 Y haplogroup, associated with infra-Saharan Africans, while YCH026 and YCH038 in the same site have the ancestral BTM91. And this is the same, BM60 lineage that Sudanese Copts have, that many scholars have argued quantifies a southerly origin of dynastic Kemet. When we look at I-1711-2 at Teopa from the 10th century, as well as 11R from Querétaro of the 8th century, right? Even BC-23 of Periquis in the 15th century have P1CT S196. And this is going to, substantiate oceanic ancestry and oceanic lineage or Melanesian lineage among the Mexican population. Then you have I-19505 from Trincheras of the 14th century, and this has the FM89 haplotype. Now this is interesting. Dr. Haber et al.'s genomic analysis suggests that the Y-DNA haplogroups C, D, E, and FT likely originated in Africa and were integral components of the Great Out-of-Africa Migration. This research provides compelling evidence supporting the African origin of these haplogroups, shedding light on their role in the broader human migration pattern. So if you look at this FM89 haplotype that we also see in pre-Columbian Mexico, we can observe it also among, Meroe Island individuals from the Christian period along the Happy River Basin's Fourth Cataract. So this African origin haplotype, rooted in the out-of-Africa migrations, we see it, in Meroe or Sudan during the Christian period, and we also see it in Mexico, right? Particularly Trincheras of the 14th century. So beyond these individuals, the modern Mexican populations has many infra-Saharan African mtDNA lineages, right? This includes LO and LOA1A, LOA2, L1 and L1C1, L1C1B1, etc., L2, right, and L2A1, L2A1C, L2A5, etc., and L3, right? And the most important one in L3 is L3H1A2A, and this is a lineage that is primarily confined to Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa. And this particular branch of L3H is found in Tanzania, Kenya, and Sudan, right? What you also see in modern Mexicans is U6A7A1B, right? And this is a haplotype that we can find associated with the Maghrebian populations, right? And what we also see is H. We see the H haplotype in pre-Columbian Mexico. And the H haplotype, the H on the mtDNA lineage, is linked to a back migration population. And it reaches some of its highest frequency among the Imohag of North Africa, right? We also see an EM2 lineage in EFGC 24093, right, in Mexico, right, with the most recent common ancestor being 3,400 years before present. And this is very, very important because many scholars would look at these African haplotypes and suggest that they are the result of modern gene flow, recent, infra-Saharan African populations who were trafficked into Mexico. But the fact that you see B2M182 in Chichen Itza, right, in pre-Columbian Mexico, right, in the 9th century, and you have all of these different lineages, right? Back migration lineages, U6, H, and the mtDNA, F, right? Oceanic, Melanesian related lineages, right? In P1, etc. is showing that there was transoceanic input into Mexico in the pre-Columbian period, especially from Africa, right? So a previous video, we mentioned this, right? Beyond the sculpture and the genes, there's also cultural and technological parallels, right? Van Sertima, Unuegbu, Mala, etc. They highlight the sudden appearance of Merkut or pyramid building, complex writing systems, iconographic motifs, like the sacred tree of life, etc., that bear resemblances to African civilizations. Linguistic evidence is also adduced, using lexical items such as guanine, a gold-copper alloy mentioned to Columbus, which Van Sertima and Zapata Carrascal trace to West African Mande languages like Kani, lexical items such as that. And we have already observed, the degree of likely aerial diffusion in between Mixoc languages, as well as Uto-Aztecan languages and Infra-Saharan African languages, right? So botanically, the pre-Columbian presence of African plants like the calabash or Lagenaria siceraria in the Americas and American plants like cotton and maize in Africa is presented as evidence of transoceanic transfer. And we're going to get into this, right? So long before Columbus, you had cotton, Gossypium is one of the clearest examples. And cotton seeds cannot survive more than 2 months in salt water, right, according to S.G. Stevens. Yet a New World cotton variant in Gossypium hirsutum verpunctatum appears in Cabo Verde, right, in the 15th century, 1466, before European arrival, having been introduced from Guinea. While Gossypium gossypoides in Oaxaca shows African affinities that are virtually impossible without human transport. And you see Gossypium herbaceum species, right? And this could only have reached the Americas through voyagers. And the degree of American cottons in Polynesia and Hawaii further illustrate deliberate long-distance dispersal. The Sanskrit term magani for American cotton confirms pre-Columbian familiarity, right, in the so-called Old World. When it comes to bananas and plantains or Musa paradisiaca, which cannot reproduce without human planting, they appear in the Americas with strong West African to Tupi lexical parallels in Pacoba, Bakuku, and Bakoko. Early Spanish chroniclers describe them already widespread, showing a pre-European African introduction. The bottle gourd or Lagenaria siceraria, found far inland where ocean drift cannot reach, must also have been human-carried. You see Vitis vinifera, which appear in proto-classic southern Mexico, right, together with winemaking knowledge, or taberna, show transfer from Africa to the Americas, because Vitis vinifera is also seen in ancient Kemet. It was known in classical Africa. And this is centuries before Spain. Conversely, maize or Z maize is found across the Old World millennia before Columbus, right, in Timor, in India, in the medieval period, right? And you see many Sanskrit sculptures showing this, right? You can see many examples of, transoceanic transfer into the Americas. So again, the Ivan van Sertima model has been validated because in numerous cases, we can see commerce occurring in different regions across the world before Columbus, right? So when we look at American narcotics in Kemet, this is a second line of contact, right? When you're dealing with coca or erythroxylon novogranatense, you see residues metabolized inside the human body, and they occur in Kemetic mummies dating from 1070 before the Common Era to the 4th century of the Common Era. You see Nicotiana tabacum or tobacco, right? And this is also American. This is found in Ramessu II, right? And also in 8 of 9 Kemetic mummies tested, right, from 1070 BC to the 4th century of the Common Era. While you see medieval Indian texts recording tobacco, tambaku, and tambrakuta, and early hookah usage long before Spanish arrival. The pineapple, or Ananas comasus, native to Brazil, appears in 5th century sculpture in Madhya Pradesh, in Kemet, and in a 7th century BC Assyrian relief, demonstrating American to so-called Old World contact. Even purslane, or Portulaca oleracea, proven to be American in origin, appears in Roman gardens in ancient China, again revealing American to Afro-Eurasian dispersal in antiquity. These botanical signatures are reinforced by shared Old World, New World insects and parasites that cannot cross oceans naturally. The lesser mealworm, or Alphitobius diaperinus is found in Kemet in 1350 BC and Peru in 1240 of the Common Era. And the drugstore beetle Stegobium panaceum appears in Kemetic burials 3400 BC and Peruvian mummies. Both depend on human food storage and not natural drift. Kemetic and Peruvian mummies also share the same drug kit, tobacco to coca to hashish model, demonstrating an identical set of psychoactive substances metabolized in the body at each side of the Atlantic. Parasitic worms likewise prove human movement. Ascaris lumbricoides is found in Kemetic mummies, right? 170 BC. And pre-Columbian South American Mycobacterium tuberculosis appears in ancient India, right? China and Kemet and pre-Columbian Peru, right? And this species of tuberculosis is believed to have been carried, across the Atlantic by seals. So those who knocked Ivan van Sertima for using Barry Fell, right, who was an expert in sea urchins, can't ignore the fact that seals were the primary ones. These sea creatures were the primary ones who carried this, Mycobacterium tuberculosis across the Atlantic. Strongyloids occur in Kemetic mummies, Peruvian mummies, and New Mexico coprolites. And Aniclosoda duodenale, or the hookworm, which cannot survive Arctic climates and thus cannot cross via Beringia, is found in the Tiwanaku mummy in AD 900 and in Brazil, even though it originates in Asia, meaning it could only have arrived through transoceanic barriers, right? So all of these collections of parasites, and again, we went over in previous videos about how tuberculosis africanum, right, that's found in the Middle Kingdom. There are West African Senegambian strains of tuberculosis africanum found in the Middle Kingdom. So it shows a, classical Africa to contemporary African dispersal. And it could be that, this species of tuberculosis originated in, the humid period, maybe a Kiphian-Tenarian related, bacterium, or it's a Happy River Basin bacterium, and then it spread across the continent with respect to the Paleo-African speakers. So viewed together, all these plants, insects, parasites, narcotics, and pathogens, form a single coherent body of evidence, proving that neither the Americas or Africa were isolated from each other. Gossypium, Musa, Lagenaria, Vitis vinifera, Zimes, coca, tobacco, pineapple, porcelain, store grain beetles, old world pathogens, in the Americas, and American narcotics in ancient Kemet collectively demonstrate sustained multi-directional pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas. And this is the exact scenario required by Ivan van Sertima's thesis that Africans, particularly West Africans in Happy River Basin and Saharan mariners, crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus and interacted with early civilizations such as the Olmecs. See, alongside this, you have Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax, both of which have an African origin, connecting the Americas and Africa prior to Columbus. There's also schistosomes, right, that connect Africa to the Americas prior to Columbus. And these are human pathogens. Plasmodium, this genus is responsible for malaria, and we already know that the HBS sickle cell Benin haplotype is found in ancient Kemet, right? That's originating in Benin. And we also detect sickle cell anemia among Mayan skeletons, right? So we could plausibly conclude, according to this evidence, that there was some contact, transoceanic contact pre-Columbus. And whether this was a result of that contact or parallel evolutions, the FODS genes, right, when it comes to fat lipids, are similar among indigenous Americans and Africans, right? So this could speak to contact. When it comes to the Niani or Malian Empire influence, in 1250 of the Common Era in the U.S. Virgin Islands, we have some remains of individuals who are Africans, right, according to their body morphology, right? We also see in the Reef Bay examples of the Tifinagh or Libico-Berber variant script in the Reef Bay region of St. John's Island. So this is evidence that infra-Saharan West Africans, right, migrated into the Americas. And especially when we look at, some of the research of Roger Blench on the Garamontes, saying that, the Tifinagh script wouldn't necessarily be limited to, the so-called Amazigh populations, but could also be used for the so-called Sudanic or Nilo-Saharan populations, as well as, Felix Chamy's analysis of the schematic, geometric, amorphous drawings of the Swahili coast being linked or a version of the Tifinagh script. We could see a Pan-African usage of Tifinagh, right, from the Garamanti era and beyond. And this same script is found in the so-called U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. So the mechanisms for this contact can be explained through historical accounts and oceanography. The central narrative articulated by Ashiedu and Sivaparan and grounded in the primary source testimony of Mansa Musa, recorded by Arab historian Al-Umari, describes the ambitious voyages of the 14th century Malian emperor Mansa Abubakari II. According to this account, he equipped a massive fleet of 2,000 ships to explore the Atlantic, a voyage from which he never returned. Scholars like Dr. Obadeli Cambone and Ivan van Sertima argue that such a voyage was not only possible but probable, given the advanced shipbuilding and navigational knowledge of the Malian Empire. They emphasize the role of the Atlantic's Canary and equatorial currents, which act as a natural conveyor belt. The theory demonstrated practically by Thor Heyerdahl's Raz expedition that he used using the papyrus boats of the Lake Chadian Basin from the Baduma people, as well as modern examples like Alexander Doba's kayak journey. So when we analyze scholars like Cambone, he also brought up an interesting fact, right? Not only, do racist scholars say that Monument F, of the Olmec head is an example of a monkey, even though it has afros and fully extended lips, right? There are European scholars who have posited that monkeys and rats were able to sail the Atlantic millions of years ago, but Africans could not, right? Only a few centuries ago. So they're basically essentially saying that Africans didn't have the ability to cross the Atlantic before Columbus, but these rats and these monkeys did millions of years ago. And that's why they assumed and they've completely affirmed that the fact that the primates and rats of the Americas are rooted in the African continent means they had to have sailed that ocean millions and millions of years ago. So it's completely hypocritical for them to promote, just an insane model like that. Obviously, Africans could sail, across the ocean. Scholars like Kumagisha have, articulated that boats as large as 70 tons were made along the Jaliba River Valley. Scholars like Diang and Diawara have documented just in numerous evidences, from the Gal ships to the Loco ships, Zopoli, etc. Ships in the Senegambian River basins, ships with sails that were able, these are oceanic watercraft vessels that were able to cross the Atlantic. Numerous scholars have detailed this, right? Despite this compendium of evidence, this thesis has been met with intense academic resistance from the conventional Mesoamerican scholars and the Americanists. Aaron Kumagisha's analysis reveals that this opposition is not merely a dispassionate critique of evidence, but is deeply rooted in sociological and theoretical framework, right? This position is articulated by critics such as Glenn Daniels, Gabriel Hasler Vieira, Montiano, Warren Barber, implicitly relies on Eurocentrism and Americanism, right? So from this perspective, the Olmecs would be a isolated population completely separate from Africa. And any type of influence of the African into the Americas would basically unseat this Western-rooted model, right? This Western-oriented model. Now, scholars like Bloat have talked about how, diffusionism originated from Europeans. This is a culture historical archaeology and existed in a time when, Europeans were basically trying to spread Western culture around the planet, right, through imperialism and colonialism. So Blout proposes uniformitarianism as an alternative to this, right, rooted in applied geology and anthropology, and basically posits that the processes that we observe today, namely the independent invention of culture, are the key to the past, right? So when we look at Martin Bernal's analysis and critique of miscreants like Hasler Vieira and Montiano, he actually identified a hierarchy of disbelief among Americanist scholars. One of his compatriots and peers, such as Thomas Lynch, viewed the hierarchy as follows. European pre-Columbian contact is readily accepted. Asian contact is tolerated, so the different instances of Asia and Oceania into the Americas is tolerated, but African contact is reflexively dismissed as impossible. Bernal argues that this hierarchy is ideologically, not scientifically, motivated. He contends that transatlantic voyages at low latitudes are in fact as easy as or easier than trans-Pacific or North Atlantic routes. The vehement and often emotional rejection exemplified by the 1997 Current Anthropology Forum that excluded Ivan van Sertima is for Bernal a form of disciplinary gatekeeping, an obsession with cultural purity, and a reflection of Eurocentrism that protects the narrative of European primacy. This Eurocentric bias, as analyzed by Sheikhantu Diop and echoed by David A. Gall and Eugenio Nkogo Ondo, has deep roots. It stems from a Hegelian tradition that deliberately cast Africa as ahistorical and devoid of civilizational contributions. The subsequent denial of ancient Kemet's Africanity and the systematic erasure of African accomplishments became a cornerstone of racist ideologies used to justify colonialism and slavery. As Gall argues, this has distorted fields like art history, which separates Kemet from the rest of Africa and ignores its influences. Recognizing the Mandingo Empire's sophisticated social philosophy, as Ondo does in his analysis of the 1222 Mandan Charter, a precursor of modern human rights declarations, is essential to dismantling these stereotypes and acknowledging Africa's profound intellectual history. In conclusion, the argument for a pre-Columbian African presence is not a French fantasy, but a serious scholarly proposition built on the convergence of evidence from multiple disciplines. While debates over the interpretation of the Olmec heads or the specific Malian voyages will continue, the work of these scholars collectively demonstrates that the isolationist paradigm is inadequate. The fierce resistance to this idea reveals less about the strength of the evidence and more about the enduring power of historical narratives in shaping identity and power. To engage with this synthesis is to participate in the decolonial project championed by these African-centered thinkers to de-hegemonize the curriculum. And as Mala et al. Urged, to embrace a more complex, interconnected, and truthful global history that acknowledges the agency and accomplishments of all ancient peoples.
True as gold, a comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Big drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kanji verse.